are structures scattered across the world that seem to defy not only time, but logic itself, and among them, a particular category stands out in a way that is both subtle and deeply unsettling, because at first glance they appear ordinary, almost unremarkable, until you begin to notice something that should not be possible. Not carved into curves, not assembled in rounded shapes, but physically deformed as if it had once behaved like something soft, something malleable, something that responded to pressure the way clay or wax would, and then, somehow, solidified into the rigid material we recognize today. If you look closely at certain ancient buildings often associated with what some call the Tartarian architectural legacy, you begin to see walls where massive stone blocks do not sit neatly stacked, but instead appear to sag, to ripple, to flow into one another as though they were placed while still pliable, frozen mid-motion in a way that challenges everything we assume about stone construction. Corners that should be sharp appear slightly drooped. Horizontal lines subtly curved downward under their own weight. Openings around, windows and arches seem to stretch as if gravity had more influence over them than it should. And the question that inevitably follows is not just how these structures were built, but what exactly the builders were working with. Because if this is stone as we understand it, then it should not behave this way under any known construction method, especially not at the scale and precision seen in these sites. Was there a forgotten technique, a lost material science that allowed ancient builders to temporarily alter the properties of stone, making it flexible before it hardened? Or are we misinterpreting what we are seeing, projecting mystery onto something that has a more grounded, if less obvious, explanation? This is where the Tartarian construction mystery begins to unfold not as a single theory, but as a layered puzzle, where each observation raises new questions and each answer seems to open the door to even deeper uncertainty. Once you begin to notice these anomalies, what seemed like isolated curiosities quickly starts to form a pattern. And that is where the mystery gains weight, because repetition suggests intention, and intention demands explanation. In multiple locations across different continents and climates, there are structures where stone blocks appear to behave in ways that contradict the expected properties of their material. Not in one or two accidental deformations, but in consistent, repeated visual signatures that resemble compression, flow, and even subtle folding. In some cases, entire sections of walls look as if they have settled unevenly, yet without the cracking or fracturing that would normally accompany such stress, which is precisely what makes these formations so difficult to dismiss as simple structural decay, because when stone fails, it usually breaks. It fractures. It chips, it collapses under pressure in ways that leave clear evidence of damage. But here, in these examples, the stone seems to have yielded instead of breaking, as if it absorbed force and adapted to it, maintaining continuity rather than losing integrity. Even more curious are the joints between blocks where, instead of clean separations, you sometimes find transitions that look almost fused, as though adjacent stones were pressed together while in a semi-soft state, creating seams that blur rather than divide. Some observers point to these features as proof of advanced techniques, suggesting that ancient builders may have used methods capable of altering the physical state of stone, possibly through chemical processes, heat, or unknown binding agents that allowed for shaping on a massive scale. Others argue for a more conventional explanation, proposing that what we are seeing could be the result of long-term environmental effects, such as erosion, thermal expansion, or gradual settling over centuries, subtly warping the original geometry of the structures. But this is where the tension lies, because while natural processes can explain minor distortions, they struggle to account for the level of smooth deformation seen in certain cases, especially when the surrounding materials remain comparatively intact. And so, the evidence sits in a kind of uncomfortable middle ground where it is too consistent to ignore, yet too ambiguous to definitively explain, forcing us to consider possibilities that sit just outside the boundaries of what we are used to accepting. When confronted with something that appears to challenge the expected behavior of a material as fundamental as stone, the natural response is to reach for explanations that can bring it back within the boundaries of known science. And over time, several theories have emerged, each to reconcile what we see with what we understand. One of the most grounded interpretations suggests that what appears to be bent stone is not deformation at all, but rather the result of highly skilled masonry, where blocks were intentionally shaped with subtle curves before being placed, creating optical illusions that mimic the effect of sagging or flowing surfaces. According to this view, master builders may have used techniques that prioritized tight interlocking joints and complex geometries, allowing structures to withstand seismic activity or long-term stress while also producing surfaces that, to the modern eye, look almost unnatural in their precision. Another explanation focuses on the possibility of cast stone, sometimes referred to as geopolymer construction, where, instead of carving solid rock, builders created a moldable mixture using crushed stone, lime, and other binding materials, pouring it into forms that hardened over time into something that closely resembles natural stone. If such a method were used, it could explain why certain surfaces appear smoother, more continuous, and even slightly deformed, as the material would have been shaped while still in a semi-fluid state before setting into its final form. However, this theory raises its own set of questions, particularly regarding the scale and consistency required to produce massive, architectural elements using casting techniques, especially in periods where there is limited documented evidence of such advanced material control. There are also those who attribute the phenomenon to long-term structural settling, where the immense weight of stone over centuries causes gradual compression, leading to subtle bending or warping, particularly in foundations that may not have been perfectly stable. Yet, again, the issue here is one of degree, because while settling can cause shifts, it rarely produces the smooth, almost plastic-like deformation observed in some examples without visible cracking or failure. And then there are the more unconventional perspectives, which suggest that we may be looking at remnants of a lost technological capability, something that allowed ancient builders to temporarily alter the physical properties of stone, making it flexible or responsive under certain conditions before it hardened again. While these ideas often lack direct evidence, they persist because they attempt to explain something that does not fully align with the conventional models. And in doing so, they keep the mystery alive in a space where certainty is still out of reach. If we move away from interpretation for a moment and focus strictly on what is documented, the conversation becomes more grounded, but no less intriguing, because there are indeed real places in the world where stone appears to behave in ways that feel visually inconsistent with what we expect. One of the most frequently cited examples comes from South America, particularly in sites like the ancient Inca walls in Cusco, Peru, where massive stone blocks are fitted together with extraordinary precision, forming irregular shapes that interlock so tightly that even a blade cannot pass between them. And in some sections, the surfaces appear slightly curved or subtly distorted, giving the impression that the stone was shaped with an unusual level of control. These structures have been extensively studied, and the mainstream explanation attributes their appearance to highly advanced stone-cutting techniques, where each block was individually carved to match its neighbors, resulting in a seamless fit that can create optical illusions of bending or flow when viewed at certain angles. Another often mentioned case is found in parts of Eastern Europe, where older buildings show signs of what appears to be sagging stone around windows and arches, particularly in structures that have endured centuries of environmental stress, including temperature fluctuations, moisture, and gradual foundation movement. In these situations, engineers typically point to long-term settling and material fatigue as the primary causes, explaining that while stone does not bend in the way softer materials do, entire structures can shift over time, creating distortions that affect how the stone appears even if the material itself remains solid and intact. There are also discussions surrounding ancient Egyptian construction, especially regarding the smoothness and apparent continuity of certain stone surfaces, which some interpret as evidence of casting or advanced material manipulation, although the dominant academic position still supports quarrying and carving as the primary methods used. What becomes clear when looking at these real-world examples is that while the visual phenomenon exists, meaning that stones can appear curved, fused, or even slightly deformed, the explanations behind these appearances vary significantly, and none of them require the assumption that stone was ever truly flexible in the way more speculative theories suggest. And yet, despite these grounded explanations, there remains a small but persistent gap between what we can confidently explain and what we can only approximate. And it is precisely within that gap that the mystery continues to live, not as proof of something impossible, but as a reminder that perception, technique, and time can combine in ways that are not always immediately intuitive. As the discussion moves from real-world observations into broader interpretations, this is where the line between investigation and speculation begins to blur, and understanding that transition is essential if we want to separate what is genuinely intriguing from what is simply compelling storytelling. The idea that stone could have once been soft or moldable did not emerge from scientific discovery, but rather from visual interpretation, amplified over time through images, forums, and videos that highlight the most unusual examples while often removing them from their original context, which creates a powerful impression that something extraordinary must be hidden behind what we are seeing. This is also where the concept of a lost global civilization, often referred to as Tartaria, becomes attached to these structures. Not because there is strong historical documentation supporting its existence as a technologically advanced empire, but because it provides a convenient framework that attempts to unify multiple unexplained or poorly understood architectural features under a single narrative. The problem is not that questions are being asked, because questioning is what drives discovery, but that conclusions are sometimes drawn before the evidence can support them, leading to a feedback loop where speculation reinforces itself, growing more detailed and confident with each retelling, even when the foundational claims remain unverified. In many cases, photographs showing bent stone are taken from angles that exaggerate curvature, or they focus on sections that have clearly undergone structural stress, while ignoring surrounding areas that remain perfectly consistent with conventional construction methods, creating a selective view that favors mystery over accuracy. There is also a tendency to underestimate the capabilities of ancient builders as if precision, complexity, and durability must automatically imply the use of unknown or advanced technologies, when in reality, history is filled with examples of craftsmanship that, while difficult to replicate today, was achieved through time, skill, and iterative knowledge passed down across generations. At the same time, dismissing everything as illusion or coincidence would be equally simplistic. because there are still aspects of these constructions that challenge easy explanation, particularly when it comes to the efficiency, scale, and long-term resilience of certain building techniques. And so the mystery persists in a delicate balance shaped not only by what exists in stone, but by how we choose to interpret it, influenced by expectation, curiosity, and the very human desire to find hidden meaning in patterns that do not immediately resolve themselves. After examining the structures, the theories, the real-world evidence, and the distortions that emerge along the way, what remains is not a definitive answer, but something far more interesting. A boundary line between what we can explain with confidence and what still resists complete understanding. Because on one side, we have documented techniques, known materials, and centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge that can account for much of what we see, including precision stonework, structural settling, and the visual illusions created by complex geometry and time itself. But on the other side, there are still moments, small details, subtle inconsistencies where the explanation feels just slightly out of reach. Not impossible, not supernatural, but not entirely satisfying either, as if we are looking at the result without fully grasping the process behind it. Not in blind belief, and not in immediate dismissal, but in a space where observation comes first, where questions are allowed to exist without being forced into premature conclusions, and where the past is not simplified just to make the present feel more certain. Because whether these stones were shaped through extraordinary craftsmanship, misunderstood techniques, or processes we have yet to fully reconstruct, the fact remains that they continue to challenge perception in a way that few other materials do. So the question is no longer just whether stone could ever bend, but whether what we are seeing is a limitation of the material itself, or a limitation of our current understanding of how it was used. And if one day we do find the full answer, will it make these structures less mysterious? Or will it simply reveal that the real mystery was never in the stone, but in how we chose to interpret it all along?